gets more bizarre. I'm not sure what you're going to say tomorrow. Looking forward to it, though. See, I'll just go ahead and tell you, since you brought it up. Jason and I are in a couple of Facebook groups together. And one of the Facebook groups we're in together, I recommended Jason be a part of it. And I don't know if you know Tony Sullivan, but he's a little wacky. So I've grown up with this my whole life. And I wanted to find a way to invite a very good friend of mine into this group and introduce him to this group in a unique way. And so I told everybody in the Facebook group he was the best kisser in the Restoration Movement. That's all I said, and I just let it hang out there. Nobody responded much to it, so that's okay. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Got me back. That's all right. All right, we're going to be in Luke tonight, Luke chapter 14, and I want to echo some of the stuff Terry said. We appreciate being here. It's been a lot of fun being able to do this with Robert. This is the first time he and I have done anything like this together on this kind of setting, I guess you can say. I mean, I've been at family camp, and he's been at family camp kind of at the same time, but this is the first time we've done it. And it's also, I'm starting to appreciate this the older I get, that I can speak at some of the same places my dad has spoken. I just think that's neat, and I enjoy that. And so that I appreciate that as well. Dad's been here, I guess, a couple of times, he told me about. So we do appreciate everything you've done for us, and we're looking forward to tomorrow as well. But as much as I've enjoyed it, we've been gone since Tuesday, and I'm ready to see Tina. And after Tina's been along with the other three boys, she's probably ready to see me, right? And so we're excited about tomorrow as well. One of the issues I think that Jesus had, and we see it in the Scripture, is Jesus had what I would call hanger-ons, right? He had people that followed him, but he had people that followed him for the wrong reason. And so Luke chapter 9, verse 51 says that Jesus resolutely set his face towards Jerusalem. And so as he's taking this trip to Jerusalem, he knows what he's going for. He understands what's going to happen when he gets there. He just tends to pick these crowds up, and they tend to want to follow him around. So you get to, I think, he tells within this trip, he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in 2001, I took a week-long class with Mark Scott as my professor on preaching the parables. And I really enjoy them. I really enjoyed that class, and I've enjoyed going through some of those parables. And he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan and stuff like that. And the crowds keep coming, and they keep coming. And we come to chapter 14. And in chapter 14, Jesus is invited into someone's home. He's invited to the home of a pretty prominent leader there on the Sabbath. And it says that the rulers of the Pharisees are watching Jesus very closely. And there was a man who they called it dropsy. And I believe he had been planted there by these men. They were trying to trap Jesus. They were trying to catch him at doing something. And Jesus heals him. But he asked them, he says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? They don't want to say anything about it. Then he took him and he healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, which one of you having a son or an ox that had fallen into a well on a Sabbath would not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. And so they start to eat. Now within this home of these type of officials, only a certain amount of people were allowed in their homes. The kind of crowds that were following Jesus would have never been allowed into the home and around the table of this man, because they were considered outcasts and stuff like that. And so, but I feel confident that they're close enough to hear the kind of stuff that's happening within the house. And so Jesus tells two parables that we're familiar with. He tells the parable of the wedding feast, because he's seeing all these people take the position of honor. And so he tells them, don't take the position of honor. You sit at the low spot, and then you allow someone to bring you up. Because how humiliating would it be for you to take the position of honor, and then someone more important than you comes in the room, and you get asked to move. Then he tells them the story. Then he tells them another parable, just right away after that, of the great banquet, where a man prepares a great banquet, and he invites all these people, and they're all going to come. And he starts to tell this story. When it's time for the banquet, he goes, and all the people that were supposed to come give these excuses of why they can't come. My favorite one is the guy said, I just got married, I can't come. I can't do this, I can't come. I have to do this. And so what's he do? He sends his servants out to get the weak and those in the highways and byways and all these people that would be really considered the scourge of society to come in and to eat with them. And they get everybody they can find, and there's still more room. And he says, well, go out. He says, I want so many people here. They eat all my food because those who are originally invited are never going to taste my banquet. So I think he's telling these stories, and I think they understood what it meant. That this is a whosoever will come. My kingdom is whosoever will. Anybody can come eat at my table. Anybody could come in. And the people outside the house, the people who never would have been allowed in the house, I can hear them or see them outside that house, and they're thinking, yeah, you tell them, Jesus, we're just as important as they are. We're just as good as they are. So Jesus begins to leave, and he tells these two parables. And here's what it says. Now great crowds, verse 25 of chapter 14, now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and he said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yet even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet, while the other is to meet who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So if there are any of you who does not renounce all that he has, cannot be my disciple. And so they feel pretty good, right? At first, we get, we can come into the kingdom. We can be a part of this. But as they're leaving, Jesus tells them, you might want to think about this for a minute. Yeah, it's okay. We want you in the kingdom. But there's some things that you might want to think about before. Because you see, Jesus knew what he was going to do. He understood he was going to the cross. He understood he was going to die. But all the people who were following him, that they expected something else. They thought he was on his way to an empire. They thought Jesus was going to go in and was going to kick Rome out. It was going to establish this great kingdom on earth. And Jesus didn't come to do that. So he has to tell them in the most vivid way possible that if they were going to follow him, they were not going to have worldly power and glory. That they were going to have to be ready to sacrifice and to suffer and even go to a cross. If there's one thing that's clear throughout the teaching of the New Testament that I don't think we do a very good job of communicating sometimes, it's the cost of discipleship. What does it actually cost me to become a Christian? Now, I know that grace is a free gift of God. I know that the only way that I could ever become a Christian is that Jesus had to die for me. There's nothing I can do to earn salvation. But yet there's a great cost to discipleship, and that's why I think Jesus tells these two parables. He's making these remarks to the crowds, and he's wanting them to hear what he has to say. And this is not the first time he's done this. He told his own disciples in Luke chapter 9 that they had to carry a cross. He told his own disciples that if a man puts his hand on the plow and he looks back, he's not fit to be in the kingdom of God. This is not the first time he's explained what it might cost someone to become a disciple of Christ, but I think we can break it down real easily to one sentence: do not get involved in something which you are unable to complete. If you can't complete what you're starting, you better think about starting it. One of the things I think that's happening here is there's something they did in the first century that we would call honor and shame. Now, none of us want to be mocked, and none of us want to be shamed. And when that happens, that can embarrass us, and it can bring us down. We don't like that. But in the first century, in Jesus' culture, if you were to be shamed, not only would it affect you, you might not be able to get a job. It might affect your children and your children's children. It was something that did not want to happen. And so Jesus is explaining the shame that comes across these people. So he talks about building a tower. He talks about it probably was built by a farmer so he could watch robbers, make sure they didn't come in to steal from him. And he's having a problem. The cost of what is it going to cost for me to build this building? What if I start and I can't finish it? Well, Jesus says you're a laughingstock, right? You're going to be ridiculed. I mean, what good is half a building? I know a guy there was a new, in the area he lived, and we lived there at one time, they had a new subdivision they were going to open. And he decided he was going to build his family a house there. And he got it started, and he framed it up, and he never finished. He paid the construction loan. He never finished the house. And within the community, it really became a running joke. You know, that people would look at that house, and they would think, man, he just doesn't finish, does he? Doesn't do anything. But what Jesus does is he just offers this common sense illustration of the need to calculate the cost before we get started on this program. Because we don't want to leave the work unfinished and be subject to public ridicule. Now, don't do what some people do with this parable. Don't overestimate the cost. You don't have to know everything and understand that everything you're going to be asked to do through your entire lives and agree to do it in advance to become a true believer. If that was the criteria, none of us would be qualified for that. But I do think Jesus is letting us know that if this is something you're going to do, there is going to be some commitment. There is going to be cost. And you're going to have to surrender your life over to me. And sometimes that gets uncomfortable. Sometimes we don't like to talk about it. I mean, when you start telling people and teaching people that when they become a Christian, their money doesn't belong to them anymore, they don't like that. But it's true. You know, we did something right before we came here. We went, with my mom and dad went, my brother and his family went. We went to Pigeon Forge. Okay, we met my parents there, and it was a lot of fun. Well, we have 2 vehicles at our house. One was a van that had almost 200,000 miles on it. So the last few trips we've taken to Georgia, 1 trip, and 2 trips to Murfreesboro at Christmas, my son has driven his car, and we've driven our car. And we decided we needed to get something new. We needed something. We had to have something. So we bought the car we have out there, that Ford Explorer. And just so you know, I don't know how I'm going to pay for it. But you know what? I have every faith, every confidence that if I do what I'm supposed to do with my money, the money to pay for that car will be there. Now, I won't be able to explain it. I won't be able to explain it to a mathematician. But when you start telling people, you're a Christian, your money doesn't belong to you. Your life doesn't belong to you. That triad, that famous triad of money, sex, and power takes on a whole new idea when we turn our lives over to Jesus. The second parable Jesus tells that we've already read concerns a king going to war. And the stakes are clearly higher here. If you fail to build a tower, the worst that can happen is public ridicule. But if you make bad judgment when you're going to war, it could cost the lives of thousands of people. And I don't want you to misunderstand the point here. In verse 32 about sending a delegation and asking for terms of peace, to our modern ear, that sounds like a negotiation, but in the world of Jesus, that meant an unconditional surrender. That I'm going to unconditionally surrender to these people. So not only should we not overestimate, we better not underestimate the demands of Jesus either. Because I wonder sometimes if the first parable is about the cost of discipleship, is it possible the second ask if we can afford to pay the price of refusing that call? The massive loss of life could include our own lives and hell and being separated from God and all good things. What is your rival to Christ in your life? Your career, your house, your car or cars, your sports, your recreation, your travel, maybe even your own family? What are those things that we need to surrender to Jesus today? Now, counting the cost is understandable. I do it all the time. I did it with this car. I do it with things we need at the house. I do it with things that my kids want. I know my kids want this, and I want to get this for my child, but can I afford it right now? Is this a good idea? It's gone on for centuries. I can tell you one in the history of our country, it happened. What do? Do you allow this war to continue? Do you allow thousands and thousands of men to die in the Philippine Islands? Or do I drop this new weapon and get this over with now? Can you imagine being Harry Truman having to make that decision? I don't think Harry Truman enjoyed making that decision. I've read some books about Harry Truman. But can I tell you something? I'm glad he did. Because you see, on a boat, leaving the European theater, heading to the Philippine Islands, there was a man named Julius Sullivan. And Julius Sullivan tells the story of his commanding officer coming out onto that ship and saying, "Boys, we're going back to Germany. War's over." And I'm awful glad that happened, because then Julius went home and married Winnie, and they made Tony. And Tony made me. But they counted what is it going to do? Well, one writer says this is a sermon to thin out the ranks. You see, Jesus has problems with enthusiasts, people who want to see miracles. We see this in John chapter 6 when Jesus preaches this sermon, and he says some very difficult things. And John chapter 6 verse 66 says, "From this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him." So Jesus is going down the road and people are following him, and he tells the crowds the story, and then he says, you have to hate your father, and you have to hate your mother, and you have to carry a cross. And you can imagine what it's like to be those people in that crowd. When they say, I can just hear some of them say, I just wanted something to eat. I just wanted to see a few miracles. You're telling me that I have to hate my mom and dad. You're telling me that I have to carry a cross. I've seen crosses. I've seen how they line the streets. I don't want any part of that. He tells us we have to hate our mother and father, and it bothers us. But we don't want to, let's be careful, because Greek is not like English a lot of times. And a lot of times that can mean choose. Esau, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Jacob I chose, Esau I did not. I don't think Jesus is saying we have to hate people. But you remember what Jesus said in Matthew, anyone who loves their father or mother me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves a son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And I don't have to literally hate my family members the way we understand hate, but our text still poses some challenging questions. If our love for God is to be so much greater than our love for our family that the latter seems like hate in comparison, is that how an outside observer of my life would describe me? For example, and as parents, am I more concerned with saving for my child's college than I am about generously providing for the Lord's work? Now, we should save for college. I don't want you to think I'm arguing against that. But I still believe one is more important than the other. Are our young people more concerned to follow God's call on their lives, even if that leads to the mission field, even when their parents are not enthusiastic or even opposed to that call? The recent study of Christian college graduates in the United States disclosed that the single most important reason some young people say they don't consider full-time Christian work as a career was the objection of their Christian parents. Because, they may not make enough money. They may not be able to pay their debts. And we shouldn't go into a whole lot of debt, but resistance to God's ministry is tragic. Especially when I know people who have sacrificed so much more. I can't think of his name. His name escapes me, but he's a preacher in Illinois. He grew up Jewish. And then he accepted Jesus Christ. He became a Christian. And if you're familiar with what happens in that culture, they have a funeral for the man or the woman who becomes a Christian. They pretend like that person is dead. But this man becomes a Christian, eventually becomes a minister, and several years later, after he had made this decision, he goes back to his old home. He knocks on the door thinking maybe his mother was ready to accept him, and his mother looked him in the eye and said, I used to have a son by your name, but he died. Or a friend of mine who was out in Africa, and these two young men came. They'd been working with them. They decided they were ready to be immersed. They were going to be baptized for the remission of your sins. And as they're immersing these two young people, the missionary comes over to my friend and he says, these two young men can't go home tonight. See, they're Muslim, and if they go home, they'll be killed. We have to count the cost of the decision we make. We don't want to underestimate the cost of discipleship. And Jesus introduces this very famous idea of carrying one's own cross, and we trivialize the cross, and it's a joke about our in-laws, and they become crosses we have to bear. But we have to understand that the cross was an instrument of public shame and torture and execution for slaves and criminals. And if you carried that horizontal crossbeam, that was a condemned person who had done heinous crimes. And that's the kind of thing that Jesus is telling this crowd might happen if they follow Him. And they have to be ready to accept it. We have to be willing to identify with Christ. We have to die to ourselves and our daily ambitions and be willing to do what He wants to do. The cost of Jesus, of following Jesus, is always potential martyrdom. Now, Terry's talked a little bit about that. I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon. But much like Terry said, I didn't think our slope would be so slippery as it has been. One writer says, "He who is not willing to die the most hideous death for the sake of his love and loyalty to Christ cannot be His disciple." So very quickly, I want to see what this tells us about discipleship. The first thing that Jesus does in these parables is He's warning us about the cost of discipleship. That's what He's doing. There's a cost to this, and we better be prepared to pay it. Anyone who comes to Christ has to make adequate preparation. This is not a minor commitment. Now, I think sometimes we give that idea to people. But this is not a minor commitment. This is a commitment that's going to demand money. It's going to demand sacrifice. It's going to demand everything I have. All of my loyalty has to be subordinate to my loyalty to Christ. And I think, and I appreciate the benefits. I love the church, and I love the benefits of belonging to the church. And I look forward to the ultimate benefit of giving my life to Jesus Christ and being resurrected and spending eternity with Him. And I love those advantages that are offered. There are great benefits of being a disciple of Christ. And shame on people who don't take advantage of those, like being a part of the church. But becoming a Christian is not a reflex of the emotions. It's a resolution of our heart and mind. Let me give you an example. When I was in high school, I listened to some really terrible stuff. I listened to Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie. Now, you go back to the 80s, that's pretty vanilla stuff, right? You understand. Well, my aunt and uncle, whom I love with all my heart, thought me and my brother were going to go to hell for listening to Lionel Richie and Mike. Now, I don't know they really thought that. But there was a church. It was not a Christian church, but they got my dad's permission, and they took me and my brother to this place so this guy could explain to us the evils of rock and roll. And folks, there's plenty to know about. There's a lot of evil there, right? Don't misunderstand me. And so that night, after it was over, he had misquoted about 14 scriptures because I went back and checked. And he talked about he was famous and he was rich. He was a famous rock star and he'd snorted cocaine off $100 bills. I never heard of this guy. But at the end of the night, they did what they always do. If you've been to these power team things or stuff like that, they really turn it on, and they really turn it on. And all these kids that I went to high school with starts flooding down the aisles. And they're not bringing records. They're bringing tapes that they made of their friends' records. Remember when you did that? Your friend bought a record and you gave them a cassette tape and they made you a tape of their record so you wouldn't have to pay for it. They're bringing all these tapes up the front. They're crying and they're putting them up there. And that Friday night they were going to burn all of them and we didn't go back. But that's what they did. And a week later, I know all those kids. I went to high school with them. And about a week later, every single one of them had made new tapes and they were listening to that music. It was emotional, right? Everything they did was based on emotion. And becoming a Christian is not a reflex of the emotion. It's a resolution of our hearts and our minds. It's a decision we have to make. And it's a decision we have to make every single day. Another thing I think Jesus tells us here, and I want to be careful, but I want to say this honestly. Jesus does look for outcasts. Jesus does love the outcast. He's accepting of the outcast. But folks, Jesus is not looking for freeloaders. He's looking for people who are willing to lose everything they have for Him. And we have to use whatever we have for the Lord's mission. Because half-hearted discipleship is not enough. Jesus, I think, honestly tells us in these parables that something done halfway is worse than something not done at all. Remember last night we read Revelation 3. I know your deeds, that you're neither hot nor cold. I wish you were either one or the other. So because you're a lukewarm, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. Before you follow Christ, He wants us to think about it. He wants us to be sure. Can we follow through on our commitment? Now, we're not perfect. We're never going to be perfect. But do we have what it takes to build a life of discipleship? Because a half-hearted commitment to Christ is not good enough. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will come to me on that day and said, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons and perform miracles? And I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. I believe half-hearted discipleship is one of the biggest problems facing us today. So let me ask you these questions. Do I yield to the Lord in every area of my life? Do I honestly trust Jesus to take care of me? And it's easy to say yes when truthfully we only give Him what we're comfortable giving Him. And these parables are not given us to deter candidates for discipleship. It's just to let us more. This is a very important enterprise, and we need to be ready for whatever it demands from us. And you may ask yourself, well, why does Jesus do that? Why does He expect that from us? Well, it's because of the conflict we're engaged in. Let me tell you something, folks. Satan lays total claim on anybody he recruits. And we have to do the same. And if a failure of a farmer to finish his tower would draw ridicule from the community, how much more would a failure of a disciple be ridiculed? You know, I've been very blessed, and one of the things, I got to go to Lincoln, and I'm very appreciative of Lincoln and what it did for me. And I've got 3 men that have just forever changed my life in that institution. There's more than 3 men, but in that institution, it was Bob Lowry, Wayne Shaw, and Mark Scott. 2 of those men are in heaven. Mark Scott's still with us. If you were at Hillsboro last year, you heard Mark preach 2 fantastic sermons on 2 Corinthians. They were phenomenal. And I had classes, multiple classes with every one of those men. I had a strong mentoring relationship with Wayne. He would email me several times, even after our seminary, and ask me questions and make sure everything was going okay. And, you know, I like to tell people I was their student. Oh, I know Wayne. I was a student of Wayne Shaw. I was a student of Mark Scott. I was a student of Bob Lowry. Yeah, I remember them. But wouldn't it be devastating to find out that one day one of those men said to somebody, hey, Matt Sullivan tells me he was one of your students. And they said, well, he may have attended my lectures, but I don't think he was one of my students. Or for Jesus to say, you know, yeah, he went to church. He even preached. But I'm not really sure he was much of a disciple. It's one of the supreme handicaps of the church that there are so many distant followers of Jesus and so few real disciples. And in every sphere of life, a man is called upon to count the cost. You know why that's important? Because there's people like me. If you know anything about me, you know that I got a lot of projects started. And they need to be finished. I know that. One of them is one of the books I'm working on through Revelation. And your preacher will not leave me alone about that. But I've told him not to leave me alone. I need that accountability, right? But think about marriage. Marriage is not to be entered upon lightly or unadvisedly, but thoughtfully, reverently, and in the fear of God. I mean, when I got married, I had to think about this. My wife had to think about this because this sounds, you know, people don't understand when you say this a lot of times, but my life was over on January 2nd, 1993. My life ended. Not because I had a terrible marriage, but because my life was now given over to her. And her life ended as she knew it because it was given over to me. And then we had kids, and a little bit more of our life was over because we had dedicated our life to those children. And same when I became a Christian. My life, December the 12th, 1983, my life ended. But a new life began. And it's that way with the Christian way. If a man is daunted, but remember, if we become scared and worried and we find that the high demands of Christ are so we're daunted and scared by that, remember, I'm not left alone to fulfill them. The one who called me to that road will walk with me every step of the way. He'll be there for me, and He'll help us make whatever decisions we have to make. So if you feel like you're a half-hearted disciple tonight, I think we've all been there, and we all need to repent of that in some way or fashion. But more important than that, if you're not a disciple of Jesus, if you've never been immersed for the remission of your sins and the gift of the Holy Spirit, the time is now. You know, I've told this story before. There were two men, true story. They were heading to World War II. One of the men looked at the other man and he said, "Hoyt, I want you to know that before I go to Europe, I'm going to go down to the church and get baptized." Hoyt said, "That's a good idea. I think I'll do the same thing." That man was the same guy that was on that ship. One of them that was my grandfather, who came back and had a family, became an elder in the Cross Plains Christian Church. The other one was my cousin Hoyt, and Hoyt never came home. Hoyt was killed in the European theater. Best decision he ever made was right before he left. We don't know the day or the hour, but we know it's going to be one day that unless Jesus returns, all of us are going to have to meet Him one day. We're going to die. Make that decision to be a disciple and make it now.